Hello everyone, this is part 1 of how to make Friday Night Funkin' in Scratch. If you don't know what Friday Night Funkin' is, it's a popular rhythm game that is similar to Dance Dance Revolution, where you have to press arrow keys to match the ones on the screen. In this series, we're going to recreate one of the levels in the original game, but you can easily change the code to make your own level as well. Anyways, here is a preview of what we're going to make with sound.
3, 2, 1, go!
And in this video, I'll start by creating the arrows that the player has to press and make it so that you can easily add and edit your own arrow patterns. Anyways, let's get started. So first off, I imported some images and sounds beforehand so that I can save some time, so I will be starting with all of these empty sprites. But I'll be putting the link to this Scratch project with all of these sprites in the description below so you can follow along. So I'm actually going to delete the first backdrop and have it so that this backdrop is showing. Alright, and now I want to show our three main characters in the game. So I'm going to first go to the boyfriend sprite and then show it. And let's see, I'm going to first grab a when flag clicked, and then I'll go to looks and grab a show. And then I'm going to grab a set size to block, and I'll make this a bit smaller, so I think I'll set size to something like 55%. Alright, and I'll move it somewhere around here. So that is about X 111 and Y negative 66. Okay, and now I'm also going to show the dad sprite. So I'll show it, and then I'll grab a when flag clicked, then show, and set size to, let's say, 50%. Okay, maybe a bit larger, so 75%. Alright, and I'll move it somewhere around here. So that is about X negative 119 and Y 10. Okay, and oh yeah, I'm also going to go into looks and make sure to switch costume to its first costume, which is idle 1. So that's its standing up costume. And I'll do the same for the boyfriend sprite. So switch costume to idle 1. Okay. And for the girlfriend sprite, I'm going to go to events and grab a when flag clicked. Then I'll show it. And I'll grab a set size to block and set it to something like, let's try 75%. Okay, maybe 70%. All right. And I'll set the X and Y to something like X 15. And Y 0. Okay, and then I'll go to looks and switch costume to idle 1. And I did change the positions a bit, so now the boyfriend sprite is at X 139 and Y negative 80, and the dad sprite is at X negative 147 and Y negative 10. Alright, now we want to add our gray arrows to the game, which is going to be at the top of the screen. So inside of the gray arrow sprite, let's grab a when flag clicked. Then let's hide the original sprite. And I'm going to just grab a set size to 100%. And let's also grab a go to front layer. So I think this size is pretty good. And now we have to create a down, up, left, and right arrow for both the left side and the right side. So to do so, let's go to my blocks, and I'm going to create a new block. And I'll call this something like create arrows. And then I'll add 2 number inputs. So click this twice. And I'll call the first one start X and the second one start Y. And then click OK. And inside of this create arrow block, we are going to create 4 arrows of the 4 different directions. So first off, let's go to motion. And then I'm going to grab a go to XY. And let's drag this start X into the X and start Y into the Y. All right. And now let's grab a point in direction block. And I'll start with the left one. All right, so let's drag that under the go to XY. And we want to create a clone of this arrow sprite. So let's go to Control and grab a create clone of myself. And after that, we want to create another arrow to the right of this one, so over here. So let's go to Motion and drag a change X by, let's just say 50. And to create the rest of the 3 arrows, we have to copy and paste this 3 times. So for now, let's just right click and duplicate the point and direction and copy and paste this 2 more times. All right. And instead of -90 for the second one, let's do 180. So that's down. And then for the third one, let's do 0, which is up. And then for the fourth one, let's do 90, which is the right arrow. All right. And let's also go to Control and let's grab a When I Start as a Clone. Then let's go to Looks and Show. Okay, so if I go to My Blocks and drag the Create Arrows custom block under the when flag clicked and put something like -200 and 100 as our starting X and Y, then as you can see, we have 4 gray arrows. But we can simplify this code a bit, so I'm actually going to create a new block, and I'll call this something like clone, and then I'll add a number input, and I'll call this one direction, and then click OK. And inside of this clone block, I'm actually going to drag a point in direction, create clone myself, and change X by block inside of here. And we don't actually need any of these blocks, so we can just take them out. And we can just drag this direction variable inside of the point in direction. And then after that, let's just drag the clone block under the go to XY in the create arrows block, and then add back the directions that we had earlier. So that's -90, and then duplicate 180, and then 0, and lastly, we had 90. So now if we click the green flag, it should be the exact same as we had before, but the code is a lot simpler. All right, cool. So now I'm going to create a few variables that might not do much right now, but will definitely help in the future. So first off, let's go to variables, and I'll create a new variable and call this something like CPU arrow start X. And then I'm going to click OK. And this will be the starting X position of these gray arrows for this character right here. And I'm also going to create a CPU arrow start Y. And I'll create another one called player arrow start X. And also a player arrow start Y. All right, so now we have these 4 variables. And before this create arrows block, I'm going to first set the CPU arrow start X to -200. And I'm going to set our CPU start Y to 100, which is the value over here. And if I drag the CPU arrow start X inside of here and CPU arrow start Y inside of here, then the arrows should still appear over here. And now, of course, we also want these 4 arrows on the right side of the screen for the player. So let's set the player arrow start X to something like, let's try 50. And then let's set the player arrow start Y to the same Y position as the CPU arrow start Y. So that's 100. And I'm just going to duplicate this create arrows block and put it after. And then I'll change these 2 into player arrow start X and player arrow start Y. All right, so if you try it out, then as you can see, we have 2 sets of arrows. All right, cool. So now I do want to move these gray arrows more to the top of the screen. So let's try something like 150 for the CPU and player arrow start Y. And all right, so I think this is a pretty good position. So now we should be fine. And I do want to, however, create one more new variable, and I'll call this arrow spacing, and then click OK. And for this variable, let's drag this inside of the change X by, so over here. And then let's go inside of our stage sprite and grab a when flag clicked, and go to variables and set arrow spacing to what we had before, which was 50. Okay. However, now it seems like the arrows are not exactly spaced apart even though they change X by arrow spacing. So to fix this, let's go to events, and I'm just going to broadcast a new message, and I'll call this something like start game, and then click OK. All right, and after this when flag clicked set arrow spacing to 50, then we can broadcast this message, and then inside of the gray arrows, we can drag all of these blocks under the when I receive start game. All right, so now if we try it out, then as you can see, the arrows are correctly spaced. Now that we have our gray arrows, now we can code the moving arrows that the player has to actually press. So inside of the arrow sprite, let's drag a when flag clicked, and let's first hide the original sprite. And then let's create a new variable, and let's call this is original sprite. And then make sure for this one to select for this sprite only, and then click OK. All right, so this variable will be useful for when we want the original arrow sprite, not the clones, to run specific code. So under the when flag clicked, let's set is original sprite to yes, because this is the original sprite. And then under events, let's drag the when I receive start game. Then let's create a block for creating the arrow sequences. So let's go to my blocks and create a new block, and I'll call this play arrow sequence, and then click OK. And let's drag this under the when I receive start game. All right, so under this play arrow sequence block, we are going to add all of the arrows that we want to appear slowly over time. And now I actually want to create another block, and let's call this something like add arrow. And let's add 2 number inputs. So click this button twice, and I'll call the first one arrow direction, and the second one delay length, and then click OK. And this block will add the individual arrows, both the direction and the delay between each arrow and the next. And just as a reminder, how this game works is that the arrows will first show up on the CPU's side or the opponent's side, and then that exact same pattern will then show up on the player side or our side. So first off, let's go to motion and grab a go to XY block and put this under the play arrow sequence block. And we want the arrows to first start on the CPU's side. So let's go to variables and drag our CPU arrow start X. Okay. And now inside of the Y, let's make the arrows start at the bottom of the screen. So let's type in -180. And then after that, we want the arrows to spawn. So under my blocks, we can now add arrows under this go to XY. So the first input that we have to put in is the arrow direction. So I'm just going to say like L for left, R for right, U for up, and D for down. So I'm just going to type in L for now for a left arrow. And then for the delay length, I'm just going to put in 1 for now. All right, and now to make the code actually respond to these inputs, under the add arrow block, let's go to looks and grab a switch costume to, and let's switch costume to the arrow direction. Okay, and since our costume names are actually L, D, U, and R for the arrow directions, then I can just type in L, D, U, or R in the first input over here. But anyways, now after that, we do want the arrows to go to its specific position based off of the direction of the arrow. So let's create a new variable, and I'll call this something like arrow clone offset X, and then make sure to select for this sprite only, and then click OK. So this variable will pretty much tell where the arrow's X position should be when it's spawned. So let's go to control first and grab an if else and drag it after the switch costume to. And first off, we want to check if the arrow direction is equal to L or the left arrow, then we want the arrow to spawn right here, which is actually the CPU arrow start X. So inside of variables, let's just set the arrow clone offset X to 0. All right, now let's right click duplicate and check the down arrow, which is the next one. So if arrow direction is equal to D for down, then let's set the arrow clone offset X to arrow spacing because it's going to move over here. And then let's duplicate this and check for the up arrow. So if it's equal to U or up, then let's set it to arrow spacing times 2, which is 1 more to the right. and then else if it's equal to R or right, then let's just set it to arrow spacing times 3. Alright, so now let's make the arrows actually move and go upwards. So inside of control, let's grab a when I start as a clone, and let's first show it and make it go to the front layer. And inside of motion, now we are going to change X by its arrow clone offset X. So that's where this variable is used. And then after that, let's go to control and grab a repeat until loop and put it after the change X. And let's make the arrows keep going up until it reaches the top of the screen and then disappear. So let's repeat until the Y position is greater than, let's say 180. Then let's change Y by the arrow move speed. And for that one, let's actually create a new variable. So I'm going to call this arrow move speed and then click OK. And let's change Y by arrow move speed. And inside of the stage, I'm going to set this arrow move speed variable. So let's try something like maybe 5 or 6. So I'll just say 6. All right, and then back inside of the arrow sprite, let's go to control and delete this clone after the repeat until. All right, and now we actually have to create the clones. So let's drag a create clone myself after all of this code inside of the add arrow block. And then we want to actually also set is original sprite to no just before we create the clone, and then set it to yes right after. And that's because we want all the clones to have is original sprite equal to no since it's a clone. All right, so if we try it out, then as you can see, we have the left arrow. All right, cool. And if we change the L to like a U for up, then as you can see, we have the up arrow. And now let's try the down arrow. Okay, and let's try the right arrow. And all right, so now we have all 4 arrows. However, if we try something like an R and then a D, so right and then down, then as you can see, both appear at the exact same time. However, we don't want that because our delay lengths are 1. But that's because we did not add the delay yet. So let's add that right now. So the easiest way to add a delay, simply add a wait 1 seconds block, and then add the delay length inside of here. However, that's not a really good solution to it, because first of all, we want the delay to match the tempo or the speed of the song. And it's not that easy to do with just a wait seconds block. And second of all, over time, this is going to be inaccurate because the scratch wait seconds block isn't exactly super accurate, especially when paired with music. So instead of this wait seconds block, let's actually add a new block extension over here, and let's add the music blocks. Okay, so instead of wait seconds, we can actually use the tempo over here, which measures the speed of the song and can be easily converted to beats, and we can pair this up with the scratch timer, which is a much more accurate measurement of time. All right, so now let's go to control, and to combine these, let's grab a wait until block, and let's go to operators and grab a greater than operator, and inside of here, let's grab a multiplication operator and put timer on the left side, and let's grab a divided by operator, put on the right side, and put tempo inside of the left side of this one, and divided by 60. So pretty much what we're going to do is that we are going to get the beats per minute or tempo of the song, and then divide it by 60 to get the beats per second, and then we can compare it to the actual beat number based on the timer that starts every time the arrow sequence is played. And this might seem a bit confusing, but it probably will make more sense as we go on. But anyways, let's drag this on the left side, and let's wait until this is greater than, let's create a new variable, and let's call this beat count, or the total number of beats in our arrow sequence, and then click OK, and wait until this is greater than the beat count. All right, now let's drag this right before the set is original sprite to no, and then since the scratch timer automatically starts and always runs, we have to reset the timer right before we add the arrows. Okay, and then after this wait until block, let's go to variables and change the beat count by the delay length. Alright, and then lastly, let's set the beat count to 0 right before the go to XY, so before we play the sequence. And now if we try it out with the right arrow and down arrow with the delay length of 1, then as you can see, there is a wait. Alright, cool. And now we want to make sure that the arrows are following the tempo of the song. So I searched up the tempo of the song that we will be using, and it's a beats per minute of 120. So let's go to music and set the tempo to 120. Okay, and let's drag this under the when flag clicked. Alright, and now we don't actually want the song to play when we click the green flag. Instead, we want the song to play when the first arrow hits the top of the screen. So inside of the arrow sprite, let's create a new variable, and I'll call this something like isFirstNote, and then click OK. And under start game, let's set isFirstNote to yes, and then inside of the when I start as a clone, once the clone reaches the top of the screen, let's check if isFirstNote is equal to yes. Then we want to play the music. So let's go to events and broadcast a new message, and I'll call this play music, and then click OK. And then after that, let's set isFirstNote to no. And now we can go inside of the stage, and let's drag a when I receive, play music. Then let's go to sound, and I'm going to set volume to 100%, and then I'm going to play sound and our music. Alright, so now if we try it out, then once our first arrow hits, then as you can hear, that is our music. Now that we have the CPU arrow sequence working, now we want to play the player sequence after each CPU sequence. So inside of the arrow sprite, I'm actually going to create a new block, and I'll call this something like switch to CPU sequence, and then I'll add a number input and call this something like delay length, and then click OK. And then inside of this switch to CPU sequence block, I'm actually going to drag these 3 blocks inside of here, and then I'm also going to add a rest for beats block from the music and drag this on the very top. Okay, and then I'm going to drag the delay length inside of the rest for beats block. So pretty much this block is similar to a wait seconds block, however it's based off of the song's tempo. So now for the player arrow sequence, we have to keep track of all of the arrows that were played during the CPU sequence. So let's go to variables and create a new list, and I'll call this something like player arrow directions, or DIRs for short. And then let's create another new list, and I'll call this player arrow delay lengths, and then click OK. And for these 2 lists, let's first delete all of both. Under the switch to CPU sequence block, I'll put it after the rest for beats block. Okay. And then inside of the add arrow block, we want to add the arrow direction to player arrow directions, and also add the delay length to player arrow delay lengths. Alright, and now under the play arrow sequence, let's drag the switch to CPU sequence block right before the 2 add arrows. And for now, let's just add a 0 for the delay length inside of here. Alright, and now if we show these 2 lists, then the CPU arrows should update these lists whenever an arrow appears. And as you can see, they do, with the right and down arrow and the 1 and 1 for the delay lengths. Okay, and now after the CPU sequence, we want to play the player sequence. So to do so, let's go to events, and I'll broadcast a new message. Let's call this something like player sequence, and then click OK. And this will happen after all of the arrows are added for the CPU sequence. And let's drag a when I receive player sequence. Then let's go to sensing, And let's reset timer. And let's go to variables and reset the beat count. And let's also go to control and make sure that only the original arrow sprite is running the code. So we want to check if is original sprite is equal to yes, because we don't want the clones to be running the code. Then we want to go to motion and set its X position to the player arrow start X now, instead of the CPU arrow start X, which we did before. And then after that, let's grab a repeat and put it inside of the if original sprite is equal to yes. Then let's repeat the length of player arrow directions. And we want to add the player arrows. So we have to loop through these two lists. And to do so, we have to create a new variable. Let's call this player sequence number. And this will keep track of what item we are currently on in the lists. And then click OK. And let's set player sequence number to 0 before all of this, and change player sequence number by 1 inside of the repeat loop. And then lastly, go to my blocks and add arrow. And then we want to add the arrow of item player sequence number of player arrow directions and put it inside of the first value for add arrow. And let's right click duplicate and also add the item player sequence of player arrow delay lengths for the second value. So pretty much what this does is that all of the arrows from the CPU sequence are now repeated for the player sequence. All right, so now if I just hide these lists. So now lastly, let's go inside of music and let's drag a rest 4 beats and put it right before the player sequence, because we do want a delay after the CPU sequence. And I'm going to try something like 2 beats for now. And now if we try it out, then the player sequence should play right there. And to recreate the arrow patterns from the game, I'm going to add a few more arrows. So I'm going to duplicate this and I'm going to change this to left arrow first with a 0.5 beat delay, and then a down arrow with a 1 beat delay, and then an up arrow with a 0 beat delay, because there are no arrows after this up arrow. And then I'm going to rest for 2 beats and then play the player sequence, which is all of this. And then after that, I'm going to add another CPU sequence. So I'm going to right click and duplicate this block. And I'm going to switch to CPU sequence after 4 beats. And keep in mind that right after this broadcast player sequence, this block begins to run. So that's why this delay is here, because we don't want the CPU sequence to play at the same time as this previous player sequence. So let's try like 4 beats over here. And then for the second CPU sequence, I'm going to do a left with 0.5 beats, a down with 0.5 beats, and then another left with 0.5 beats, and a right with 0 beats. And by the way, I tested this all beforehand using trial and error. So if you want to use a different song, then you might have to test it with different beats and delays. But anyways, after this one, I'm going to rest for 2.5 seconds and then play the player sequence. All right, so I'm going to test these first 2 sequences out and see how they work. Alright, so those were the first 2 sequences, and they seem to be exactly on beat with the music. Alright, so now I'm going to add the rest of all of the sequences for the entire song, so yeah. Alright, I finished creating the player and CPU arrow sequences, and before I test it out, let's first animate the characters a little bit. So for each of the sprites, let's grab a forever loop, and inside of looks, let's grab the next costume block and put it inside of the forever loop. And then let's go to control and grab an if. And so for the boyfriend sprite, there are 5 idle animation costumes. So inside of the code, let's check if the costume number is greater than the 5th costume. So if costume number is greater than 5, then let's loop back to the first costume. So let's switch costume to idle 1. And then inside of the music blocks, let's grab a rest for beats block and then put it after the if. And inside of here, let's create a new variable, and I'll call this something like animation wait time. And then let's click OK. And let's drag this inside of the rest for beats block. All right, and inside of the stage, let's also set the animation wait time under the when flag clicked. And let's do something like 0.2 for that. And now let's copy this forever loop for the two other sprites. So we can just drag this and then drop this inside of these two. And then I'm going to put this under the switch costume 2 block inside of the dad sprite. And inside of the girlfriend sprite, I'm going to drag the forever loop under the switch costume 2. And we don't actually need this if because the girlfriend sprite only has the idle costumes. Okay. And we can test everything out with the basic idle animations and the player and CPU arrow sequences. Alright, and that was pretty much it for our player and CPU arrow sequences that we just created. And as you can see, the arrows went off the screen in sync with the music. Anyways, that's it for this tutorial. If you enjoyed it, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe too, if you haven't already. In the next tutorial, I'll be making it so that you can press the arrow keys for the player, and I will also add specific animations for the characters based on the arrow that was hit. By the way, the completed version of this project is shared on my Scratch profile, link is in the description below. Anyways, that's it for this tutorial. See ya!